If you want me to, I'll give you some history of the United States to back up and give validity to what was just said here. People in the United States are basically misinformed, and that is they have believed for 200 years or so that they have a sovereignty when in fact they don't. The United States is still a British colony and has been from the very inception. The quote-unquote founding fathers were members of the Crown. They were attorneys, Benjamin Franklin in particular. And so you had, for instance, the signers on the Declaration of Independence. It was signed by the Crown and the attorneys for the Crown. And so in reality, nothing is different south of here than it is right here. And as he mentioned, the conquest of the native people by a bankrupt corporation and the treaties that were signed have absolutely no validity. So we try to deal with those things. One of the great tragedies in the United States is that the United States government, the corporation, has tried to obliterate through apartheid. They've tried to obliterate the people off the land. And not only just by war, and I can verify some of the things that have been said here, but the things that I've seen in my lifetime. And that is, they have tried to destroy the opportunity of the people to increase their numbers by sterilization, by all manner of things. And then I've seen also, as he mentioned, with the position of the churches, and that is the churches have tried to take the children away and turn them into corporate citizens. We've seen this continually, and it still goes on today. So it's I can verify what's been said here by the things that's happening right down south down here. And if you want to read a book that's very interesting, that gives a great deal of the history, there's a book that's been recently put out by an archaeologist called 1491. And it dealt with the conditions on North America and South America prior to Columbus, which was in 1492. So anyway, it's a very good book. It gives you a lot of the history that you won't find anyplace else. And so you can understand those things. Now let me back up a little bit on the history to give you an idea of what did go on in the earliest of times. We had a group of people, and they were variously called trading companies. In particular, we have the East India Trading Company that sought to basically subjugate the whole world. And they have not stopped. They continue to do so. But anyway, back in the centuries that have gone past, they have the East India Trading Company was the organization, the corporation that funded the colonization of what we call the 13 original colonies or states. And they're the ones that created the debt. And it is true that the people from Europe who have occupied North America have always done so under bankruptcy. And this was understood. What they tried to do to avoid the bankruptcy was they tried to incorporate and shift the liability from the private side into the public. And they did that, in our case, down in the lower Canada. I use that. They did that by incorporating under the Articles of Confederation. And under the Articles of Confederation, the new corporation took on the debt and the liability that was owed to the East India Trading Company, and consequently the Queen, or the King in that case, under an incorporation. Now they found that their incorporation was flawed because they had no way to enforce their international treaties. In other words, they had not successfully incorporated the principles of international law under admiralty into their Articles of Confederation. So at that point, they formed a new corporation, and they had a new document which was called the Constitution for the United States. Now, the Constitution for the United States basically took over and assumed the liability that had been assumed by the previous corporation under the Articles of Confederation, which assumed the debt of the colonies that owed to East India Trading Company. So the Constitution that everybody spends so much time worrying about was a filing of bankruptcy. The bankruptcy had already been declared. And the people, the Europeans who operated on the soil in North America, had come here under bankruptcy, and they continue to be so. Now, so with the creation of the Constitution, there was a filing of the bankruptcy, and that occurred in 1789. Now, under the Anglo rules of bankruptcy, a nation can go into bankruptcy, and it's for a period of 70 years. Now, the question for the first period of bankruptcy was what shall be the surety? What can we use to guarantee the payment? Because the debt was owed to basically King George to the East India Trading Company, or however they arranged that whole thing. See, was the Bank of England in existence then? It was, wasn't it?
1694. Yeah.
Okay. So the Bank of England was in existence. And so the question was what can we use as the surety for the bankruptcy for King George? And it was determined that they would use the land. And so the land was leaned up against. As I mentioned, the bankruptcy lasted for 70 years. So if you add 70 on to that, you come to 1859, which would have been the termination of the national bankruptcy had the debt been repaid. But the debt was not repaid. As a matter of fact, the debt was increased. And in consequence of that, a second bankruptcy was contemplated. But because all the land in the north was all leaned up, and there was no way to use it for surety again, they had to find a new surety. So what do you think the federal government in Washington, D.C. decided to do? Go out by conquest and seize all the freehold land they could get their hands onto. So in consequence of that, in 1860 or whatever, they concocted a new war, and they called it a Civil War. Or they called it the war between the states, when in fact the states were not at war with each other. It was the federal government that was at war.